April 23, 2006, Kiev, Ukraine. The city was vibrating with the frantic energy of a Tuesday afternoon, a sea of silver SUVs, neon advertisements, and the constant, rhythmic chime of cell phones. But at the intersection of Elenovskaya and Kirillovskaya streets, time didn't just slow down, it broke. In the middle of the swerving traffic stood a young man. He looked about 25 years old, wearing a crisp, high-collared wool suit and a checkered cap that looked like it had been pulled off a 1950s movie set. He wasn't a hipster, and he wasn't an actor. He was a man drowning in a world he didn't recognize. He stared at the glass and steel skyscrapers as if they were alien monoliths. He looked at the digital billboards with a raw, visceral terror in his eyes. Two police officers, thinking they were dealing with a confused tourist or perhaps someone under the influence of a heavy narcotic, approached him. They asked for his identification. The man reached into his pocket and handed them a small red booklet. The officers didn't laugh, they froze. It was a Soviet Union internal passport. The ink was dark and fresh, the paper was stiff, and the stamp was from the Kiev Komsomol. The name on the card, Sergei Ponomarenko. The birth year, 1932. According to that piece of paper, the man standing in front of them was 74 years old, but the skin on his face was smooth, his hair was jet black, and his hands didn't have a single liver spot. When the officers asked him what year it was, Sergei looked at them with a heartbreaking sincerity and said, "It is Wednesday, the 15th of August, 1958. He asked the police for a street that hadn't existed for 50 years. He showed an ID card from a fallen empire that looked like it was printed yesterday. But the scariest part wasn't what he said. It was what he was holding in his right hand. Slung over his shoulder was a Yashica 635 camera, a relic of a bygone era. It looked brand new, as if he had just unboxed it. The officers didn't know what to do with a man who claimed the world had changed overnight, so they did the only thing they could. They called the one man in the department trained to peel back the layers of a broken mind. Dr. Viktor Barin was tired. He had spent 20 years in the Kiev psychiatric ward listening to men who thought they were the reincarnation of Tsar Nicholas II, or students who had taken too much LSD and thought they could fly. To Barin, the human mind was a machine that frequently misfired, and it was his job to find the mechanical failure. When he walked into the interrogation room, he expected a prankster. He expected a performance artist, or perhaps a delusional young man in a vintage costume. He sat across from Sergei Ponomarenko and sighed, clicking his pen. He thought to himself, "I've seen Napoleon, I've seen Jesus, now I have a time traveler." But Sergei didn't fit the profile. He wasn't manic. He wasn't agitated. He was profoundly, deeply confused. He spoke with a polite, formal cadence that had vanished from the Ukrainian tongue decades ago. He told Dr. Barin that he had been walking down a street in 1958 with his fiancée Valentina when he saw something in the sky. He described a bell-shaped object that moved without the sound of an engine. He said he raised his camera to take a photo, and when the shutter clicked, the world shifted. The trees were gone. The cobblestones were gone. The silence of 1958 was replaced by the roar of the 21st century. Barin watched Sergei's micro-expressions. There was no tell, no smirk, no sign of a rehearsed lie. Sergei looked at the digital clock on Barin's desk and asked why the numbers were glowing. He asked why the doctor was using a pen made of cheap plastic instead of a fountain pen. It's one thing to claim you're from the past. It's another to have the physical sensory reactions of a man who has never seen a computer screen. Barin began to feel a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He looked at the Yashica camera sitting on the table between them. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, but it was an artifact. It shouldn't have been functional, yet it looked like it had never seen a speck of dust. Before we go deeper into what was found on the film inside that camera, I want to ask you something. Imagine the roles were reversed. If you accidentally jumped 50 years into the future, would you try to find your family, or would you be too afraid of what you might find? Would you want to see your own gravestone? answer family or afraid in the comments. Stick around, because what the police found when they finally took that camera to a darkroom changed this from a psychiatric case into something that still haunts the Kiev Police archives to this day. Subscribe to develop the film. Dr. Viktor Barin was a man of science, and science relies on the tangible. You can't dissect a ghost, and you can't put a delusion under a microscope. But you can examine a machine. As Sergei Ponomarenko sat in his holding cell, staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of a man whose soul was still stuck in 1958, Barin turned his attention to the Yashica 635. It sat on the scarred wooden desk in the station's evidence room, looking impossibly out of place. This wasn't some battered antique found in a grandfather's attic. There were no scratches on the leatherette casing. The twin lenses, the viewing lens and the taking lens, were crystal clear, devoid of the milky oxidation or fungus that typically plagues vintage glass stored for decades. It looked as though it had just been pulled from a shelf at a Soviet department store during the Khrushchev thaw. Barin called in Vadim Posner, a forensic photography expert who had worked with the department for 30 years. Posner arrived with a look of bored annoyance, expecting to find a modern camera disguised as an old one. But when he picked up the Yashica, his hands began to shake. "Doctor," Posner whispered, his thumb grazing the film advance knob. "This is impossible." "It's a vintage camera, Vadim," Barin replied, his skepticism still acting as a shield. "They're rare, but they exist. Collectors keep them in mint condition all the time." "No," Posner corrected him, pulling a jeweler's loupe from his pocket. "It's not just the condition of the body. Look at the film inside." He carefully opened the back of the camera in a light-sealed bag, his fingers working by touch alone. When he pulled the roll of film out, he didn't find the brittle, crumbling plastic one would expect from a 50-year-old artifact. He found a roll of Agfa color film. Posner stepped out of the dark bag, holding the canister as if it were an unexploded grenade. "This film, it's specialized. It's a high-sensitivity roll that Agfa stopped producing in the 1970s. If this film were actually from 1958 and had been sitting in a drawer for half a century, the chemicals would have degraded. The emulsion would be dry. It would be a ghost, yellowed, cracked, and completely unusable. Even in a vacuum-sealed vault, the background radiation of the Earth would have fogged the images into nothingness by now." He held it up to the fluorescent light. "But this roll, it feels fresh. It feels chemically active. It's as if the plastic hasn't aged a single day since it left the factory." The tension in the room thickened. For Dr. Barin, this was the moment the floor began to tilt. If the man was a fraud, where did he get a brand-new roll of film that hasn't been manufactured in 30 years? How did he keep a 1950s camera in factory-new condition while walking through the soot and grime of modern Kiev? Barin watched through the observation glass as Sergei sat in the interview room. The young man wasn't acting like a con artist who had successfully fooled the experts. He was weeping silently. He had asked for a glass of water, and when the officer brought it in a plastic cup, Sergei had recoiled. He didn't understand the material. He didn't understand why the water didn't taste like the well water of his youth. He was a man experiencing future shock in its most literal, agonizing form. "Develop it," Barin ordered. "Doctor, if I use modern chemicals, I might ruin it," Posner argued. "I need to find the specific developing process for this exact Agfa chemical composition. It hasn't been used in decades." "Find it," Barin snapped. "If those photos are what he says they are, then we aren't dealing with a psychiatric patient. We're dealing with a hole in the world." The next few hours were a blur of cold sweat and clinical silence. Posner transformed the station's small forensics lab into a makeshift 1950s darkroom. He sourced the specific chemicals required, compounds that were themselves becoming rarities in an age of digital sensors and megapixels. Barin stood outside the darkroom door, the red in-use light casting a bloody hue over the hallway. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Sergei was part of a deep-state experiment. Maybe he was a sleeper agent trained in retro tech to confuse the authorities. But why? What was the gain? Inside the darkroom, Posner was performing a digital age exorcism. He wound the film onto the developing reels in total darkness. He could feel the texture of the film. It was supple and oily, the sign of a living emulsion. He submerged it in the developer, the stop bath, and the fixer. When the timer finally chimed, Posner didn't come out immediately. There was a long, heavy silence. Baron knocked on the door. "Vadim? What do you see?" The door creaked open. Posner was pale, the chemical smell clinging to his lab coat. He held a strip of negatives, still dripping with fixer, up to the light. He didn't say a word. He simply pointed to the images. Even through the inverted colors of the negatives, the truth was undeniable. The first few frames showed the streets of Kiev. But it wasn't the Kiev Baron knew. There were no billboards for Coca-Cola. There were no cell phone towers disguised as trees. The cars were Pobeda and Volga sedans, curvaceous, heavy-metal beasts from the Soviet Golden Age. The people in the background were wearing trench coats and fedoras. "The light," Posner whispered. "Look at the quality of the light. It's not a filter. It's not a digital edit. The grain structure is perfect. These were taken with a Yashica lens in 1958. I'd stake my career on it." But it was the final 3 frames that made Baron's heart skip a beat. The first was a portrait of a young woman. She was beautiful, with her hair done up in a 1950s beehive style, smiling at the camera with a look of pure, unadulterated love. "Valentina," Baron whispered, remembering the name Sergei had cried out during his arrest. The second frame was Sergei himself. He was standing in front of a monument that had been torn down in the 1990s. He was wearing the exact same suit he was wearing right now in the holding cell. He looked happy. He looked like he belonged. Then came the final frame. It was a shot of the sky. It was slightly blurry, as if the photographer's hand had been shaking. In the center of the frame, hovering just above the rooftops of a 1958 Kiev skyline, was a dark, metallic, bell-shaped object. It had no wings. It had no visible propulsion. It looked like a puncture in the fabric of reality. "He wasn't lying," Posner said, his voice cracking. "He took this photo, the shutter clicked, and the film advanced. But between frame 24 and frame 25, the world changed." Baron took the negatives and ran back to the interrogation room. He slammed the prints, still damp, down on the table in front of Sergei Ponomarenko. "Tell me," Baron demanded, his clinical coldness finally shattering into desperation. "Tell me exactly what happened when you took this last photo." Sergei looked at the image of the bell-shaped craft. His eyes widened, and he began to tremble. "The sun. It got too bright," he whispered. There was a sound like a crystal glass shattering in my ears. I blinked, and the air smelled different. It smelled like burnt electricity. I looked for Valentina, but she was gone. The street was gone. Everything was loud, so loud. Baron looked at the photo of the girl, Valentina. If Sergei was who he said he was, this girl, his fiancée, would be an old woman now. If she was even alive. He picked up the phone and called the archives. "Search the records for a Valentina Kulik, last known address from 1958. Find her. Now!" He thought he was looking for a witness to a crime. He didn't realize he was looking for a ghost who had been waiting 50 years for a man who hadn't aged a second. The interrogation room was thick with the scent of ozone and the sharp, vinegary tang of fresh photo developer. Dr. Baron sat across from Sergei, but he no longer saw a patient. He saw a walking paradox. On the table between them lay the physical manifestations of an impossible timeline, glossy prints that shouldn't exist, showing a world that had been buried under the dust of history for half a century. "Let's go through these again, Sergei," Barin said, his voice dropping the clinical edge and adopting the soft, coaxing tone of a man trying to talk a jumper off a ledge. One by one, tell me what I'm looking at. Sergei reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the first photograph. It was a wide shot of a Kiev street corner. To a modern eye, it looked like a postcard from a museum. The cobblestones were clean, polished by the tires of rounded, snub-nosed buses. Men in high-waisted trousers and women in modest floral dresses moved through the frame like ghosts caught in amber. "This is the corner of Kreshchatik," Sergei whispered. "We were going to get ice cream. It was a hot day. The radio in the cafe was playing Moscow Nights. I remember the smell of the linden trees. Why are the trees in your world so small, Doctor? And why is the air so gray?" Barin didn't answer. He couldn't. He was looking at the background of the photo. In the corner of the frame was a movie poster for a film released in July 1958. The date was verifiable. The architecture was exact. But more importantly, the perspective was impossible to fake. This wasn't a photo taken of an old photograph. The depth of field, the grain of the film, and the way the light hit the dust motes in the air indicated a primary source. This was a now that had happened 50 years ago. The doctor slid the second photo forward. This was the portrait of the woman, Valentina. She was radiant. Her eyes were wide, caught in a moment of genuine laughter, a strand of hair falling across her forehead. She looked like she was about to speak. "Valentina," Sergei breathed, his eyes welling with tears. "She told me not to waste the film. I told her that a face like hers was the only thing worth saving for the future. I didn't know. The future would be this." "You said you were with her when the incident occurred," Barin pressed. "In this photo, she looks happy. Was this taken moments before?" 10 minutes before, Sergei said. "We walked toward the river. I wanted to show her the new lens I bought. I was bragging about the Yashica. I told her it was the finest Japanese engineering. And then, the sky changed." Barin moved to the final photograph, the anchor of the mystery, the bell. In the 21st century, we are used to CGI. We are used to grainy, out-of-focus blobs in the sky that people claim are UFOs. But this was different, because the camera used, the Yashica 635, is a twin-lens reflex camera. It captures an incredible amount of detail on a large 6x6 negative. The object in the sky wasn't a smudge. It was a physical entity. It looked like a giant metallic bell, or perhaps an inverted top, hovering perfectly still above the rooftops of the Stalin-era apartment blocks. Its surface wasn't smooth. It had ridges, a series of concentric rings that seemed to vibrate even in a still image. There were no windows, no landing gear, no exhaust. It looked like it was made of a dull, non-reflective substance that absorbed the afternoon sun rather than reflecting it. "When I looked through the viewfinder," Sergei explained, his voice cracking, "it didn't look like a machine. It looked like a hole in the sky. I pressed the shutter because I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't going mad. As soon as the mechanism clicked, that snick of the metal blades, the sound of the city vanished. I felt a pressure in my chest, like I was being pushed underwater. When I opened my eyes, the bell was gone. Valentina was gone. And the buildings had grown tall and ugly." Barin leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. As a psychiatrist, he was looking for the break. Usually, when a patient hallucinates, there is a gap in their logic, a place where the fantasy fails to meet reality. But Sergei's story was backed by physical evidence that was currently baffling the best forensic experts in the city. The film was fresh, the camera was new, the passport was authentic, and the photos showed a UFO hovering over Kiev in 1958, an event that, if it had actually happened, should have been in every KGB file in the Soviet Union. Barin stood up and walked to the small window of the interrogation room. He looked out at the 2006 skyline. He thought about the Cold War. He thought about the secret Bell projects rumored to have been developed by scientists in the 40s and 50s. Was it possible? Could a high-frequency electromagnetic field or some unknown propulsion system have warped the space-time around Sergei at the exact moment he triggered the mechanical shutter of his camera? Did the camera act as an anchor, a physical save point that dragged him across the decades? "I'm going to leave you for a moment, Sergei," Barin said. "The officers will bring you some food, real food, not from a plastic bag." Sergei looked up, his face pale. "Doctor, am I going home?" Barin paused at the door. He felt a profound sense of pity for the man. "We are doing everything we can to understand what home means for you right now." As Barin stepped into the hallway, he was met by his assistant, who was holding a dusty manila folder. "Doctor, we found her," the assistant whispered. Barin felt a jolt of electricity run down his spine. "Valentina?" "Valentina Kulik. She's 74 years old. She lives in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. And doctor, you're going to want to see this. We asked her about Sergei Ponomarenko. She didn't just recognize the name. She fainted." Barin took the folder. Inside was a photocopy of a police report from 1958, a missing persons file. It stated that on August 15, 1958, Sergei Ponomarenko had vanished in broad daylight while walking with his fiancée. The KGB had interrogated her for weeks, suspecting he had defected to the West. She had maintained the same story for 50 years. He didn't run away. He didn't die. He simply ceased to exist while she was looking right at him. But there was one more thing in the folder. A photograph provided by the elderly Valentina. It was a photo of her and Sergei, taken in 1957. Sergei was wearing the same suit, the same cap. He was holding the same Yashica camera. Barin looked through the reinforced glass at the young man sitting in the cell. The Sergei in the 1957 photo and the Sergei sitting 10 feet away were identical. Not a day older, not a hair out of place. The doctor realized then that he wasn't just witnessing a psychological phenomenon, he was witnessing a tragedy. Sergei was a man who had been deleted from his own life, only to be pasted into a world that had no room for him. "Keep him under 24-hour surveillance," Barin ordered the guards. "Lock the door. No one goes in or out without my signature. I don't care if the Prime Minister shows up. That man is the most important person on this planet." Barin walked toward his office, intending to call the Ministry of Science. He had the photos. He had the witness. He had the artifact. He had everything he needed to change the world. He didn't know that by morning he would have nothing but a locked room and a set of security tapes that defied the laws of physics. The psychiatric wing of the Kiev Police station was not designed for comfort. It was designed for containment. The room where Sergei Ponomarenko was held sat at the end of a long, fluorescent-lit corridor. It had no second exit. The walls were reinforced concrete, and the single window was obscured by a heavy steel grate, the bars spaced too closely for even a child to slip through. Outside the door, a uniformed officer sat at a small desk, his eyes fixed on the only way in or out. Dr. Victor Barin left the station at 2 a.m. on April 27th. He was exhausted, but his mind was spinning. He had the photos, he had the negatives, and he had the testimony of an old woman who had spent 50 years mourning a man who was currently sitting in a cell downstairs, looking exactly as he did the day he left her. Barin's plan was simple. Get 4 hours of sleep, return with a government task force, and begin the most significant scientific inquiry in human history. He should have known that time doesn't like being put under a microscope. At 6 a.m., Barin's phone screamed him awake. It was the station sergeant. His voice was thin, vibrating with a brand of fear that Barin had never heard from a veteran cop. "Doctor, he's gone." Barin didn't ask who. He was in his car and halfway to the precinct before his brain had fully processed the impossibility of the statement. When he arrived, the hallway was a hive of panicked activity. The guard who had been on duty, a man named Sokolov, was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. "I didn't move," Sokolov stammered as Baron approached. "I swear on my mother's soul, doctor. I sat right there. The door was locked. I have the only key. I didn't even go to the bathroom. I stayed right here." Baron ignored him and pushed into the room. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The plastic cup of water sat untouched on the bedside table. Sergei's vintage suit was nowhere to be found, but on the small desk in the corner sat the Yashica 635 camera and the Soviet passport. It was as if the man had simply evaporated out of his clothes and his life, leaving only the artifacts of his journey behind. "Check the window," Baron commanded. The bars were intact. They hadn't been sawed, bent, or tampered with. The dust on the windowsill hadn't been disturbed. The room was a tomb that had failed to hold its ghost. "The footage," Baron said, his voice a low growl. "Take me to the security room. Now." The security office was cramped, smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. On the monitors, they pulled up the feed from camera 4, which had a direct, wide-angle view of Sergei's room. Because it was a psychiatric observation cell, there was a camera inside the room as well as in the hallway. They started the playback from 4:30 a.m. On the screen, Sergei could be seen pacing. He looked agitated. He kept walking to the window, peering through the bars at the pre-dawn sky of 2006 Kiev. He looked like a caged animal sensing a storm. At 4:41 a.m., Sergei sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked directly into the camera lens. His expression wasn't one of fear anymore. It was one of recognition. He looked as if he heard something, a frequency or a sound that the microphone couldn't pick up. He stood up and walked toward the center of the room. "Watch the timestamp," the security officer whispered, his finger trembling as he pointed at the digital clock in the corner of the monitor. 4:41:52. Sergei is standing in the center of the room. 4:41:53. The video signal flickers. A static hiss ripples across the screen for less than half a second. 4:41:54. The room is empty. There was no door opening, no blurring of the image to suggest high-speed movement. There was simply a man, and then there was a space where a man used to be. Baron watched it 10 times. He watched it frame by frame. In the final millisecond before the flicker, something strange happened to the light in the room. The shadows didn't move, but the light itself seemed to bend, curving toward Sergei as if he had become a gravitational well. And then, nothing. "Search the building," Baron ordered, though he knew it was futile. Search the roof, the vents, the basement. He couldn't have just disappeared. But as the hours turned into days, the search turned up nothing. Sergei Ponomarenko had vanished from 2006 just as abruptly as he had arrived. The police were baffled. The brass wanted the whole thing hushed up to avoid looking incompetent, and Dr. Baron was left with a folder of impossible photos and a camera that shouldn't work, but Baron couldn't let it go. There was still one piece of the puzzle left. Valentina. He drove to the outskirts of Kiev to the address his assistant had found. He found a modest, tidy apartment filled with the smell of tea and old paper. Valentina Kulik sat in a high-backed chair, her face a map of half a century of waiting. When Baron showed her his credentials, she didn't look surprised. She looked relieved. "He came back, didn't he?" she asked softly. "He appeared in the city, Valentina," Baron said, sitting across from her. "He was looking for you. He was still 25 years old." Valentina didn't cry. She simply nodded, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. She reached into a drawer in her side table and pulled out a photo. It was an old sepia-toned print, but the quality was remarkably sharp. "This arrived in my mailbox in 1970, she said. No return address, no letter, just this. Baron took the photo. His heart stopped. The photo showed Sergei Ponomarenko. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s. He was standing on a balcony, and behind him was a skyline that Baron didn't recognize. There were buildings that looked like shards of glass reaching into the clouds, and strange, sleek vehicles blurred in the background. Sergei was smiling, and in his hand, he held a device that looked like a modern smartphone, decades before such a thing existed. But it was the back of the photo that broke Baron's scientific resolve. In handwriting that matched the signature on the 1958 Soviet passport, it said, "I am okay. I am trying to come back. Time is not what we thought. Give this to the doctor who will ask for it." Baron stared at the ink. The doctor who will ask for it. Sergei hadn't just traveled from 1958 to 2006. He was bouncing. He was a stone skipped across the surface of a lake, touching down in different eras, leaving breadcrumbs for a man who hadn't even finished medical school yet when that photo arrived in 1970. The realization hit Baron like a physical blow. The bell-shaped object wasn't a UFO in the traditional sense. It was a vehicle. Or perhaps it was a glitch, a natural phenomenon that Sergei had accidentally triggered with the shutter of his Yashica. As Baron walked out of Valentina's apartment, he looked up at the Kiev sky. For the first time in his life, he didn't see a clear blue expanse. He saw a series of layers. He saw 1958, 2006, and whatever year Sergei was currently trapped in, all stacked on top of each other like transparent sheets of film. Sergei Ponomarenko wasn't a madman, and he wasn't a prankster. He was a man out of sync. He was the first human being to discover that the present is an illusion, and the past is just a room we've walked out of, but the door isn't always locked. Dr. Victor Baron lived the rest of his life as a man haunted by a ghost that hadn't even been born when he started his career. He kept the copies of the Yashica photos in a safe in his home, away from the prying eyes of the department and the shadowy officials who eventually came to collect the original negatives. For Baron, the mystery of Sergei Ponomarenko wasn't just a police case. It was a cracks in the foundation of everything he believed about the human experience. We like to think of time as a river, flowing in one direction, carrying us from the cradle to the grave with a steady, relentless pull. But the case of Sergei suggests something much more terrifying. It suggests that time is an ocean, and sometimes the tide goes out where it should be coming in. Sometimes a person can get caught in a rip current and dragged 50 years away from the person they love. The legend of the man with the camera has grown over the decades, moving from hushed whispers in Kiev police stations to the deep corners of the internet. Skeptics point to the lack of official, public access to the original Agfa film canisters. They claim the photos of the 1950s could have been staged by a master of historical recreation. But how do you stage a man's entire life? How do you explain Valentina, a woman who lived half a century in mourning for a man who walked back into her life for 48 hours, looking exactly as he did when he left? If you look closely at the final photo Valentina received, the one allegedly from the year 2050, you see more than just a man who hasn't aged. You see a man who has stopped trying to fight the current. In that photo, Sergei isn't looking at the camera with the terror of 2006. He's looking at it with the calm of a traveler who has seen the beginning and the end. He is standing in a Kiev that has been rebuilt, a city of light and glass that we can only imagine. The bell-shaped object, the hole in the sky, has been spotted in other parts of the world, documented in grainy footage from the 1940s and high-definition sensors in the modern era. Some call them UFOs. Others call them chronospheres. But maybe they are just doors. Doors that open when the right mechanical frequency, perhaps the literal click of a camera shutter, syncs with a specific atmospheric condition. Sergei Ponomarenko is still falling. He is a man caught in a loop, a human glitch in the cosmic software. Somewhere, right now, He might be stepping out into a Kiev of 1920 or a Kiev of 2100, clutching that same Yashica camera, wondering if the next person he meets will be a doctor with a skeptical eye or the woman he was supposed to marry. The physical evidence remains. The Yashica 635 is still in an evidence locker, its metal cold, its lenses clear, waiting for the next hand to wind the film. The passport is still valid in a country that no longer exists. And Valentina? Valentina passed away a few years after her meeting with Dr. Barron. They say that on her deathbed she didn't look like a woman afraid of the end. She looked like a woman who was finally going to the ice cream shop on Kreschatik Street, where a young man in a checkered cap was waiting for her with a camera and a smile. Time is not a straight line, it is a circle. And if you're ever walking the streets of your city and you see a man who looks like he stepped out of a history book, looking at the skyscrapers with tears in his eyes, don't call the police. Just tell him the year, tell him it's going to be okay, and for heaven's sake, don't let him take your picture, because once the shutter clicks, there's no telling where or when you'll wake up. If you found this investigation into the impossible compelling, hit the like button and let us know in the comments. Do you believe Sergei was a time traveler, or was this the most elaborate hoax in Soviet history? For more cases that defy logic and reality, click the video on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe. After all, you wouldn't want to get lost in time without a guide.